And we're all good, Steve. We're
Okay,
all live.
great. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Planning Advisory Committee's meeting of the 31st of March 2020. My name is Steve Tanner and I'll be chairing the meeting this evening. We like to make our meetings available to as many people as possible, regardless of where they are. So we're using a hybrid setup of here in person in the Town Chamber and online via Zoom. For those in the room here, firstly, welcome. And secondly, a bit of housekeeping. The emergency exit is to the rear corner of the room, which is over here. And the assembly point is in the car park. Toilets can be accessed at the end of the corridor on the right-hand side, and there is an accessible toilet to the right of the lift. You don't have to wear a mask in the room, but if you want to, that's absolutely fine, no problem. For panelists on Zoom, if you want to raise a question, please raise the electronic hand by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen. For those in the room, please raise your hand and there'll be a microphone passed around at some point. For attendees on Zoom, please pose questions through the Q&A board. Attendee's name will become visible on the questions board for the record as your question is answered. For those attendees in the room, again, please raise your hand. Tonight, some councillors are here in the room and some councillors are online, but the councillors online will be participating accordingly. Tonight, Jane will clerk and Hannah will manage the questions board and participant settings. The meeting will be recorded for minuting purposes and we also live stream to our YouTube channel. We do operate our meetings as a safe space. We would ask everybody to be respectful of other people's opinions and views and comments accordingly. So the running order we have for tonight, firstly, we will be having a presentation by Geraint Jones and Charlotte Birchall from Savile on the Inox Hill proposal. Then Jane Llewellyn will quickly run through some history of the site, because there is a bit of history on this particular site, and from there we will go on to questions and comments from the public. So, first off, if we could ask Geraint and Charlotte.
There you go. Just bear with me a second while I find the presentation.
Just while you're pulling that up, we'll make a brief start and introduce ourselves.
If you press the button.
Thank you. So we'll just introduce ourselves. So I'm Geraint Jones, this is my colleague Charlotte. We're planning consultants from Savile's, appointed by a prospective developer, landowner, who's reviewed the site and is looking to proceed with the planning application. So this is an opportunity to bring the proposals before you before a formal application is lodged, to be able to hear your thoughts. The intention is that, as well as presenting to you today, I think some people will have already received notice, obviously for people who are here, will have received notice. We'll also be remaining outside after we've presented and departed the room. So there are some forms that you can take away with you or complete here today before we leave, if you'd like. If you want to take them away, we can give you a stamped envelope so you can take that and we can have those comments. Obviously, our intention is to take any comments away so that we can consider those before an application is lodged. That's the purpose of the pre-application process. But if we start by just giving you a quick overview, so if we can move on to the next slide. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the location, how it relates to the existing context of Froome. So it sits just on the northern edge of the town on a site that's currently undeveloped, with Inox Hill just running to the western boundary. Development to the south, open fields to the east, and then some small residential development further to the north. Firstly, in terms of the form of application, the intention is to progress with an outline application. You may well be familiar with the planning process, but for those that aren't, there's primarily two forms of applications. You can either submit in detail or submit where you're just trying to establish the principle of development. So that is what we're trying to do here. So an outline planning application, it will be focused other than point of access all of the matters of detail would be kept for a reserved matters stage, which would follow. So it really is the focus on where the additional residential development is required for the area, and if so, whether this is an appropriate site for that to be focused. So as I said, details of layout, appearance, landscaping scale, all to follow if the application were to be successful. So we're going to present to you an indicative layout today, which at least helps you to understand a likely form of development. So an outline still needs to prove that in principle there is a deliverable scheme there, but it doesn't go into the level of approving that detail through the outline. If we can move on to the next slide. I think probably in location we can move on to the next one. I think there's a good enough understanding. So just to give you an overview as our starting point as consultants and looking at the wider consulting team, what we do as a starting point, I appreciate there's a planning history to this site, and that helps us to inform and understand what are the key opportunities and constraints for the site, and what would influence a likely layout and how that might be delivered. So as you can see on the screen there, starting to understand particularly topography, the ability for a point of access and how that could be delivered, proximity to residential properties that already exist, so you can start to understand residential amenity and how a development might need to interrelate to those existing dwellings, ecology, understanding landscape features that both relate to wider landscape issues and long-range views, but also how that interplays with local ecological features, sort of habitat corridors that serve local wildlife. So what has happened in the last several months is a consulting team's been appointed to try and build an evidence base so that we could properly understand those constraints and then bring forward a development proposal that we feel responds to them appropriately. So my colleague Charlotte is now going to talk to how that design evolution has brought us to where we are today.
Thank you. Could we just have the next slide, please? So as Garrett said, this is an outline application. We are required to demonstrate how the proposal could fit on the site, but this is just an indicative layout, so it's not saying what it would look like, it's just a possibility for one layout. So this is a first iteration where we'd had some input from the consulting team and started to respond to the site's constraints, so mainly the topography, the drainage which flows from the south east down to the western side. So we've got an attenuation pond there to assist with that, buildings orientated to respond to the topography, and we've got offsetting around the boundaries. You can see the tree belt on the northern boundary on the left side of the screen, and some offsetting on the eastern boundary as well to help with ecological improvements. The access point has been assessed by the transport consultants to make sure that that can actually function safely as an access point. And we've also got a pedestrian link just on the south side of the attenuation pond on the western boundary to improve the site's connectivity, so people could walk potentially through that point instead of having to go all the way around. So this is the first iteration, which, as I said, seeks to respond to the initial assessment. We've then continued to carry out assessment from ecology, landscape perspective, and a bit more detail on the drainage. So we've then got a second iteration of the scheme which follows on from that. So if we could just go to the next slide. So this is just setting out the results of the ongoing assessment from the consulting team and what features we can incorporate to work best with it. So just to start with the drainage, we've got, because of the geological underlay, the site's suitable for drainage swales, so it's following a gravity-led drainage pattern, so we have swales around the boundaries. The pond has been moved down to the northern edge and enlarged, so that actually follows the true fall of water across the site down the slope. The ecology considerations, we've had to enhance that more, so we've increased those buffers along the western boundary and the northern and the eastern boundary as well. Kept the pedestrian link. If we could just move on to the next slide. So this is a second draft iteration of the scheme, which just picks up on all those opportunities and constraints that we've seen in the previous slide. So we've got the woodland buffer around the west, buffers to the north. We've got increased open space just to the south of the attenuation pond, which just opens up the site a little bit more. And we've also, on the western boundary, started to move the housing away from that boundary, so we don't have back gardens backing onto the buffer, and that just helps to work with lighting and providing an ecological corridor around there. So this scheme, the unit numbers have reduced from the first iteration that you saw, which was for about 80 units. This one is for up to 71 units, and that includes 30% affordable housing, which is 21 affordable units, which would just be probably pepper potted around the site. So that's a policy compliant amount of affordable. That is where we are at the moment. So we'd very much like to have comments and feedback so we can incorporate that into the next iterations as we move forward.
Thank you.
I think on the last slide, we've just got the...
Great, thanks very much. Jane, do you want to give some details about the history of this site before we go on to the questions?
Happily, although I'm sure most of the people sitting in front of me are fully aware of the history of the site, but very, very briefly, so you'll all be aware that this site is outside of the development boundary. It was previously considered by Mendip for allocation in their local plan. However, that didn't go through as an allocated site on the basis that Mendip's sustainability appraisal said that the site is not suitable, certainly for that much development due to its landscape impact and primarily due to its location beyond the ridgeline north and west of Froome in an area of rural character. And the site lies within an area identified as good quality land, which is prominent and important to the setting of the town. One of the other issues, again, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that the site actually lies within the sewage buffer zone, I believe in a flood risk zone 2 and 3 as well. So site history, there was an outline application in 2018, which again was for a residential scheme of 96 mixed tenure dwellings. That application was withdrawn. Prior to that, there was another application in 2013, again for residential development. That application was also withdrawn. There were applications earlier than that, going back to 1987, I believe, and 1982. Both of those applications were refused. One refused at appeal. I do have some text from what the inspector said, but I'll be here all night if I read that out to you. And I thought one comment from the previous applications from the environmental protection team at Mendip was worth noting, just in as much as that they're not able to support the application on the basis of the position of the development next to the wastewater treatment works. Their principal reason for objection was that the development would exacerbate an existing situation against the expectations of amenity afforded to new development. Essentially, they were concerned that any residents who might live in the new development would be have problems from the flies, and yeah, I'm sure you're all fully aware of that. And obviously, the site is within the Mells Valley Special Area of Conservation, and that any development there could impact on the bats and local habitat. So yeah, that's just a very brief summary of the history and some of the main concerns I would suggest that affect the site.
Thank you, Jade. Right, I'm guessing there's a lot of questions and comments that want to come back from the public. We do try and listen and hear from as many people as we possibly can tonight, but obviously we can't go on all night. So if when I get to your particular question, it's already been answered, please just let me know and we'll move on. But I think At that point, yeah, let's take some questions or comments from the members of the public. Just gentleman here.
Oh, yeah, so Graham's going
Could
to
you?
be our
Oh,
mic
Right.
man.
you have to use a microphone because
Very good.
then the people online can hear. Okay.
Dr. Nigel Salisbury, Spring Gardens. What is evident for all those plans is that here is a steep field. Currently, the rain drains into the grass. Largely on that plan were drainage routes downhill, presumably ultimately into the River Froome. As we all know, the River Froome is very apt to flood, particularly in the Spring Gardens area. So it would merely add a problem which does not exist at the present time.
Okay. Thank you very much. Graham, did you want to? Yeah, because I know you put your hand out and you've got the microphone. So.
Where to start? Just in terms of need to start with, I mean, I got some figures today that between 2007 and 2021, there were 1,712 houses built in Froome. Current planning consents within Froome amount to 1,370 additional houses, which are not there yet. That's as many houses again as have been built since 2009. So any question of the need to build outside development boundary when that many dwellings have already been approved, it seems to me absolutely non-starter. The other thing, I mean, just across the valley, there's the TH White site that had planning approval for 52 houses, as I recall, and that hasn't been developed, presumably because the land's too expensive. This land will be much cheaper because it's outside development limits, which is what the attraction is, of course. And then just one thing, I mean, I know that this was said by the speaker there, was that we mustn't be kind of conned by these nice pictures, because what happens in these situations is that they get the planning approval and it's flogged off to the highest bidder. They come up with a totally different scheme which we haven't seen and we won't see for a long time. And by the time they've got their outline permission, it's just a matter of arguing about the details. So yeah, this is the time to stop it.
Thank you, Chair. Related to the last speaker's point about housing numbers, I wonder if Savills could explain to us where they think Mendip currently stands vis-à-vis the 5-year housing land supply, and if they are intent on relying on Section 11 of the MPPF, could they explain how the tilted balance they would believe the tilted balance would work in their favour in this case?
Do you want to reply, or would you like to come back in writing to us at some point?
No, they want to hear, yeah.
Happy to come back. There's obviously a number of points being raised there. I don't know whether can we comment on the various things raised. So I suppose the first one was raised as flood risk. Obviously, from a technical perspective, the way planning applications are required to respond to that is to ensure that there's no increase in Greenfield runoff rate off-site. So yes, there's more hard surfacing than there is now, and at the moment, a lot of the water may percolate through the ground. So what happens here is there's an assessment carried out about the amount of hard surface being created and the pond, the surface attenuation that you have there must control that amount of water so the Greenfield rate doesn't increase. So in very simple terms, how big is the hole that allows water to move away off from that pond? So that would be something that would be assessed as part of the planning application. Have we got the analysis right of how much hard surfacing is likely to arise? The precise detail would obviously be resolved through the reserve matters application to make sure that was right, but the parameters would be established at the outline stage. In terms of overall housing need, I think there's obviously a couple of questions all relating to the same point. I don't think anyone can get away from the fact that there's across the country there is a housing crisis. We are not building enough houses, and that is why there's if the development plan process doesn't deliver against the needs that they're required to deliver, then applications come forward which sit outside of the plan process. And that's where we are with applications like this. And people can disagree about where those houses should be directed, but in terms of that broad principle that there is a need. So the last 5-year housing land supply stats that I think are the April 2020 stats, which is saying that there's 3.5 years supply against the 5 years that we should be targeting. It's worth saying that there's a slight moving feast with housing numbers, because the government it keeps reviewing exactly how they should be delivered and where they should be delivered and what those numbers should be. And so that may evolve during the course of the application, and the council will determine that at the point of time when it's before a committee. But as our starting point is that there's a shortfall in housing being delivered, and that should weigh in favour of the application when it comes to a committee. In terms of the sort of more advanced comments, I think that's something we'd probably provide a written response to that if there was some more detailed analysis required.
I'll pass the microphone to there, but as I've got it, I just want to say that the housing crisis is that houses are too expensive, not that there aren't enough of them. The current, I checked today, the current ratio of salary to house value in the southwest is 1 to 12. And you know, we've had all these houses built in Froome, 1,700 and odd. The prices are just go up and up. It doesn't make houses more affordable.
Can I respond to that in brief? I think it's fair to say I absolutely acknowledge that housing is too expensive for the majority. I don't dispute that. But the number of housing, the amount of housing available, is a critical part to the cost of housing. So it's not the case that there is. I mean, I know from I live in Bristol, and I know that a lot of my peers cannot afford housing, but there is a lack of housing to help bring that cost down.
There are jobs in Bristol, there are jobs here. I've worked in Bristol and I've moved to Froome, and thankfully I've had to work from home for the last 2 years. If I didn't, I'd have to get a train, which takes an hour. I'd have to try and get a car park in the train station, which there are no trains parked at the train station. An hour there, an hour back. To live in a very modest, sorry, I don't need it. Very modest.
Yeah, for the online ID.
Very modest 3-bedroom bungalow. And, you know, I'm a newcomer to Froome, and there are no jobs here. I try to get a job, and I can't afford the wage drop.
Can we hear from the gentleman at the back? Because I think he's been waiting and get a reply.
If you're so socially aware, why aren't you putting applications in for brownfield sites, not greenfield sites, which are outside the building area anyway? Just seems ridiculous. It's greed on the part of the owner, isn't it?
In terms of brownfield versus greenfield, obviously the landowner only has the control of the land that they have. I think there's planning policy directs to where development should be brought forward. Clearly, brownfield land often attracts significant expense. And I think the honest answer as a planner, the only way we're going to unlock, there's not enough brownfield land to deliver the amount of houses that nationally we're told we need. But if we're going to unlock those brownfield lands, then what we need really is financial support to unlock those sites. So the organisations like Homes England are set up to do that, but unfortunately they're directed more so at really significant brownfield sites. So you see successes in some of the major cities where significant industrial sites have been cleaned up to make them commercially available to the market. Unfortunately, where those sites are small and complex, that kind of unlocking is less likely to come forward because they tend to be brought forward by very large organisations, and they're looking to get the most bang for their buck as government organisations, and so they focus on the sites that will deliver the most housing, and that tends to be in the large cities.
Any more questions? The gentleman over here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. There are a number of issues that I just wanted to raise. The fact that Mendip themselves, as we've heard, carried out a sustainability appraisal, which indicated very clearly that this would have a huge landscape impact on our town here and that approach. It is actually, by building on that bit of land, you actually link the town to a little hamlet of Spring Gardens. And that actually spoils the nature of that little hamlet. I don't know whether you're aware, but residents who live on that bit of the road, I don't know whether you're calling it Innex Hill, I'm not sure that is actually Innex Hill, but have suffered with sewage running down that road. The sewage works is very close there. Many of the residents in this room have suffered from a huge number of flies from the sewage works. And this is not exactly a sensible proposal to have many houses being put in that sort of situation. And I would be interested in any response that you had to that. This is important pasture land. This is not poor land, this is good pasture land. And less carbon is generated as a result. And it is important that that is saved. I was very concerned to see that the hedges were butchered a few months ago, exactly, I think it was 4 days before a surveyor came to look at the hedges. It raised my suspicion that that was done deliberately before any wildlife survey could be properly carried out. I don't know whether you're also aware with that you've indicated the flow of water, but in that field, in the centre of that field, there are 3 springs. When there is rain and flooding, those springs bubble up in the middle of that field. I don't know whether that attenuation pond would deal with that situation. Those are the points specifically that I wanted to raise.
Thank you for that. Obviously, a comprehensive response, and I'll cover each of the issues as best I can. So I think the starting point is landscape impact, and in a nutshell, why has the situation changed from when it was assessed previously? And I think the direct answer is that the need to respond to the landscape remains if a development was to be brought forward. So our landscape advice is to look very carefully at that northern corridor and how we can respond to that as part of the layout. Inevitably, if you develop a site, there is some closing of that gap, but how that closing is perceived is of importance to planning. So if, as you're travelling up the road to the west, is that predominantly a hedgerow where the housing is less perceived? So your feeling of travelling along that route is that is less of the development that you see that is beyond it, and more of an experience of a rural road still. There's also how far you can pull it back from the northern boundary, and is there offsetting as a result of the drainage pond and the public open space that the layout talks to. But as I say, it's an outline scheme, so they're things that could be established through parameters if a scheme was consented. In terms of whether there's been a change or not, or why the passage of time is relevant, every time there's a need for housing, there's a need to reassess where that can be delivered. So your starting point is, last time was we need to deliver X amount of houses, and so many sites have been put forward, and we look at which of those sites are best able to accommodate that development. We're in a situation at the moment where there's a shortfall of housing, and not looking into the distant future, in the near future, there will be a need to look for further allocations to meet the needs of Mendip. So looking at those, it's a constantly evolving process. So what may have been perceived as effectively, by looking at all the sites available last time, it was considered to be lower down the order, there's a need to release more housing. So you're starting that process again and saying, okay, if we need to deliver another 3,000 houses, where do they go? So you're having to find new sites each time. So it's part of that ongoing review. So we keep, in terms of delivering development, local authorities keep having to look beyond, do they deliver in new settlements? Do they deliver on the edge of existing settlements? And it's a continual challenge for authorities. Where do they deliver? Are there enough brownfield sites to meet the need? And inevitably there's not. So that talks to that landscape point. Obviously in terms of sewage and more broadly drainage, as I say, that they're technical matters. And so there's an expectation that an application, when it's submitted, deals with those technical matters because they go to the heart of principle, or they deal with the principles of those technical matters. So in the same way as you mentioned springs on site, that's something that you can validly raise in terms of the consultation process, and the council will test our technical submissions to see whether they're robust and whether they appropriately respond to those concerns. And in the same way as the local sewerage network, in terms of any impact that the development might place on that sewerage network, again, that's again a technical solution. The number of units, how much does that put through into the system? Is the system capable of taking that additional flow? You talked then about the wastewater treatment works. We're well aware of the issues from the previous applications. I think the straight answer to that is that there really is an obligation on the statutory provider to resolve that issue. And I know that's easy to say, and they've been very slow in resolving it. But in terms of whether you should be refusing applications, the council will need to look at the point in time when they're determining an application, is there a likely resolution to that? If it's not resolved in its entirety, is there an ability to create a situation which is broadly acceptable in terms of residential amenity? I think the important thing to say about that is this would not be the nearest houses to that treatment works. The stakeholder, sorry, the statutory provider has an obligation to use existing residents to resolve that. And I know it's been high on the priority list, and there's some moves towards trying to find a solution, but it really does rest with them. But equally, I appreciate the Environmental Health Officer will be looking carefully at what the timeline looks to any solution, and tying that to the timeline of any build of any development that gets approved. Is it likely to be a satisfactory position at the point when people would be moving in? Pasture land, so that talks to agricultural land, mentioned about the quality of that. If there's a need to release greenfield sites, the question is, if you're not delivering here, what other sites would you be delivering on, and what would be the quality of that land? And also the overall quality, does that quality of land, is the loss of it so significant as to warrant refusing development? And this is an issue, lots of areas where there's significant settlements around the UK, particularly sort of market towns, have a lot of good quality land around them. So if you're going to release green fields, quite often the choice isn't, can we go to poor quality agricultural land and still have a sensible expansion of a town, or it's looking at, you can't separate out the two issues because you need to look at the development as a whole. It is something that the officers would look at as part of the picture, but it is only part of the picture, and I don't think the fact that it's good quality land in isolation justifies refusing development where there's a proven need. Ecology, so I'll keep this brief, I know there's a lot of issues I'm trying to cover. We've obviously undertaken assessments, and your questions about the timing of those assessments. I think the planning history of the site means that everyone is well aware of what the key issues are in that local area. So the timing of any hedge trimming doesn't impact on an understanding of what the key habitats are in that location and the key ecological corridors. And our application will talk to that, and you can review the evidence that we've submitted. And if there's any gaps that you feel are in that evidence, then you'll have the opportunity to challenge those, and we would have to address those challenges where the council felt that there were gaps. I think that covers the key points, but I'll leave it there. Conscious I'm taking up a lot of time.
Oh, she needs a microphone.
Yeah, there's
Well done,
a
Graham.
microphone. Thanks, Graham.
Okay, I'm Andrea Howland. I live opposite the proposed site, right opposite the ponds that you intend to put in. And can you tell me how you will stop those ponds from flooding onto the two properties that are right opposite them? I know how much water comes off that hill, and not just that hill, down the road. And you're talking about putting a large pond in. Who's going to look after that pond? And I'm not talking immediately, in the future when it's silted up. Who's going to be clearing that out so that it doesn't flood onto the properties opposite? And you're also talking about a large amount of stale water, which is going to cause even more flies than we already have. So, you know, we've already got a massive fly problem down there, which we have letters every year from the sewage works about them apologising and trying to implement bat boxes in hedges and whatever to encourage the wildlife. But they don't work. We have a massive problem, and you're going to put a stale pond opposite me, which is going to cause an even bigger problem for not just me, for the houses you intend to put on the site. But my main issue is who's going to look after these ponds. They never get looked after. They're left to fill with silt until they can't take any more water, and then they will flood.
Thank you.
Thank you. First, talking to the risk of flood, I think that comes down to drainage design as to whether the pond is designed appropriately to prevent that happening. I mean, arguably, there's potential when you deliver sites like this at the moment. There's obviously an uncontrolled drainage situation in terms of a lot of greenfield sites, and by delivering development on it, there's a potential to control to a greater degree than it currently is. It's a different way of managing it. At the moment, it's a greenfield site and managed in fairly limited ways, whereas what we'd be talking about is a development where you'd have a detailed design responding to the levels of water anticipated, and the levels that you have to look at project a long way into the future. So there's a sensible degree of anticipation about what may come. I think the key thing for the design of that pond would be to make sure, in that worst case scenario, that there was going to be any overtopping. You would design the pond to prevent overtopping, but if those concerns were raised, I think that's something that can be sensibly designed into a scheme to make sure that flows move in a particular direction, so they're captured elsewhere on the site as opposed to running off and outside the site. But
there is nowhere else to catch it, is there really? You know, you're talking about a massive pond opposite two properties that we know flood from, you know, so, and you're also talking about increasing a problem with flies and mosquitoes that we already have.
So I suppose the question about the flies and the management and maintenance, as part of a planning permission, if it's agreed, there would need to be an ongoing maintenance situation put in place for.
Prove you can solve it, does it? That's just words. That's not proving that you're actually going to solve that problem. It's all right to say, yes, we're going to do this, but once you've built those houses and our problem's even worse, you know, who do we come back to?
When a planning permission is granted, there's planning conditions which secure certain obligations on the developer, and there's Section 106. So collectively, there's a group of obligations, and that can relate to numerous things, whether it's payments to deal with education contributions, whatever it may be. But the council has to be satisfied that there's reasonable solutions put in place, and you're reasonably bound to those solutions to prevent the concerns that you're raising. So you're right to raise those concerns now, but more appropriately during the course of the planning application to raise them during the consultation period. But it's for the technical experts at the council to ensure that the scheme is robust. We obviously put forward a scheme we believe is robust. The technical experts at the council assess that. If they find it is robust, then it's for the planning authority then to bind us to those solutions and ongoing management and maintenance in terms of the issue you're talking about. So it's not words, it's things where physical actions and physical works are bound to the planning permission. So the enforcement team at the council has the ability to pursue a developer and the management company if they're not responding appropriately to what they're bound to.
My name is Dr. Mark Ball from Pedlar's Grove. So 3 questions separately from what's been raised already. So I understand is it Somerset Road and Weymouth Road are trying to reduce traffic next to Victoria Park and Mary Bailey Park. So how is building the entrance where you propose actually going to increase traffic past the Pedlar's Grove Park currently? So you're trying to increase traffic around the park, which other parks in Froome are trying to reduce. Second, I just applied for schools for my daughter in Froome. The 3 first choices we applied are all fully oversubscribed. I actually had the figures from Somerset Council last week. So how is building additional houses going to help my daughter find a school place this year? And then finally, we look at the infrastructure. We all know that the infrastructure is reduced, whereas the houses increased. We applied for swimming lessons, and we were bluntly told by Mendip, no chance. So please explain to me how this proposal would certainly reduce traffic next to the park, give my daughter the ability to go to one of the first 3 choices, not a choice, the first 3 choices, and also increase the infrastructure we have available to us.
In terms of traffic impact, I think the situation, I appreciate there's lots of areas where people are trying to move people away from car usage. What happens with the planning application is it assesses the degree of impact, and it's not assessing is there no change, it's assessing whether the level of change results in an unacceptable solution. So there may be a desire to bring traffic movements down overall. Clearly, delivering 71 units does generate...
71 people, that could be 5 in a house.
Sorry?
That's not 71 people, that's 71 houses.
Yes.
There's no buses, we're in the country, there's no buses here, there's no public transport. There's no public transport in Bristol.
Yeah, so to respond to that, so 71 houses, there are...
Your first plan's actually 80, not 71.
So the scheme that we've evolved to is the 71 solution. So what we're trying to show is that there's been an evolution from where we started off several months ago to where we are now and the application to be lodged. In terms of 71 units, the transport consultant's report that would accompany the application assesses, based on the scale of the houses likely to be delivered, what that generates in terms of traffic demand. And by understanding the scale of the road network it goes on to, the pinch points at certain junctions, whether that impact is acceptable. We reach our own conclusions on that, but that's also tested as part of the planning application. So I understand why there's a desire to drive down the amount of movements going through, but what a council's asked to assess is whether the number of movements going through is acceptable or not. And we believe that the levels would be acceptable. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that when you're looking at a planning application, if there's a specific issue about an area where you're going past the park, is there an ability to reduce speeds as opposed to just total number of movements? So when a development... Yeah, but there's what I'm talking about is if you were delivering contributions through a planning application, if there was a specific concern that the council has and it's looking at a development like this, should it be looking at maybe changing the road infrastructure in that area so you control speeds rather than just having somebody out there issuing tickets? Do you change the road layout? Is there something else that can be done? But these are technical issues that would be looked at by the Highway Authority. You mentioned education. What planning application is required to do is to deliver to meet the needs of the residents that would live at that location. So what happens is the Education Authority... So in the same way as with transport, the authority for an outline application is required for education, is required to look at what the likely number of children generated that would live at that site, so would arise from a development of that scale, and you need to be able to prove that there's sufficient capacity to meet the needs of those children. So the question for the authority then is is there an appropriate ability for funds to be paid by the development to meet education needs if there's a shortfall? I think there's probably two issues here. One is that contribution may be made. Your bigger concern is about the distances, the ability to go to the preferred local schools. What the Education Authority does is look at arguably wider areas, and it moves catchment areas around to respond to planning applications to say, well, if we deliver, well, no, and that has to be it's a sensible conversation from the Education Authority's perspective. Can we create a situation where those people can be accommodated without making an unacceptable situation? And again, this goes to the sort of the traffic point. What you may consider to be an unacceptable situation doesn't necessarily meet the same test as a planning application. So what you need to present those concerns to the Planning Authority and the Education Authority as part of the application, and they should be considering those very carefully. The obligation on us is to make sure that if we're required to make a contribution to deliver new facilities at a particular school or whatever it may be, that we've committed to those and we're bound to them through the planning application. If there's a case where you can't deliver that education space, then that would be a reason for refusal. So we have to deal with that as part of the application. So that's a common part of the planning process, but it's a challenge. I think a lot of the infrastructure is difficult because it's under strain across the country, and there's certain examples where the way the system is set up and the way things are funded, the obligation isn't always on a developer to meet those needs because it might be paid through other taxation systems. The things that fall on a developer, we will have to deal with through the application.
Yeah.
Can I,
Okay, we'll have the gentleman here first, then the lady, then this lady here. Okay, thank you.
just say that the reason that the previous application was withdrawn was not only through local support by the residents, but Wessex Water, the Environment Agency and the Highways Agency all deemed it unfeasible.
Thank you.
Do I have to press something now? Hi, yeah, my name's Linda Oliver. I'm the local county councillor that covers this area. It was brought to my attention about this planning application, and I did a bit of background research on what you've done before, which is 2 applications, both of which have not proceeded, both of which have been outline applications. And I apologise if I'm repeating things that's been said. I thought this meeting started at 7:30, so I'm sorry I got here late. I'd just like to say, I think it's very disappointing for these people in this room and people affected by this application that you're doing, once again, unless I misheard what you said, another outline application, because that doesn't give people, even the statutory authorities, enough opportunity to actually read the detail. The devil's always in the detail of what's involved in that planning application. So we get into a round of consultation, but with very little information. So, you know, your traffic management plan, the last one, was deemed inappropriate. Like this gentleman just said here before, the 2 accesses that were proposed was refused by Highways. There was an issue there. And I think the detail of the houses, the scale, density, and the type is very important for people to be able to comment in a proper manner and be able to focus their objections on things that really matter in terms of planning policy. And I assume that the pond that you referred to, is it an attenuation pond? Well, they're not meant to carry water in, they're meant to drain water. So it would be good if they... if you had a proper full planning application, then the Drainage Authority, which is in Somerset County Council in combination with Mendip, they would have a chance to sort of look at the figures and calculate those instead of you doing things piecemeal. If you feel that convinced that this land is appropriate, and looking at a comment made on the 22nd of May by Natural England, CPRE, the town council, the land's on a slope, so it's hardly conducive to significant development. So I think if you're going to put a planning application in, these people deserve this time for a full application to come in, and they've got all the information they need to then take things further. So do the statutory consultees.
Linda. you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I would like to come back in brief on that. I suppose the in-principle point is that outline planning applications are a large part of the planning process, and statutory providers across the country find those, provided there's sufficient detail submitted with the application for it to be tested, they find that an appropriate approach. So I don't think it's fair to say that we should have to deal with that in a different way here, providing the evidence base is sufficient and is robust. In terms of the previous applications, I wasn't involved with those, but we're very cognizant of what was the issues raised in those. We reviewed those as part of the process. The consulting team that's pulling together this application, we're confident is well aware of those, and we've tried to address and deal with those. So things like the access, drainage, all of those issues we look to respond to in the application, but you'll have your opportunity to review what we submit and to challenge us if you don't think that detail is appropriate. And we're very open to conversations, but the idea of where you're dealing with a 5-year housing land supply planning application, to go to a detailed application at this stage is it puts a load of additional process in where we haven't established principle. What we're trying to do here is say, in the event that there's a housing need, is this an appropriate location to direct development as a starting point at the scale we're proposing. So density would be determined because the maximum number of houses would be determined, and the tests and the infrastructure analysis all talks to that scale of development. So, but we're very open to further conversations, and if you feel there's gaps, I'm happy to leave you my number, and I'm happy to have separate conversations. And obviously there's an email address that's been provided for people to provide comments directly to Charlotte and myself, which we can feed through to the wider team. So we're very open to conversations. So it probably covers most of it.
Can you hear from this lady?
Need the microphone.
You need the microphone if you're going to, please, Linda. No, it's for the people online. They can't hear unless you've got a microphone.
I was just interested in what you just said. Have you had pre-application advice with Mendip?
Yes, we're in ongoing pre-application.
And do these people know what Mendip have said about this land and what you've said to them? Has that been shared with them earlier today?
No, we've not shared that. It was a pre-application.
It would be very interesting to know what the pre-application advice you got from Mendip District Council. And I've been around a long time in planning. I was a district councillor before, and before in Kent. And it is not unusual for people to put full applications in. It's a lot of developers put those in because they've got confidence in what they're doing and they're sure they're doing the right thing. So I do, but it would be interesting for these people to know what Mendip have advised you, because before it wasn't in an allocated site in the plan. I'm not so sure it still is.
No, it's not.
It's not. So it's outside the development. It's not allocated. And I heard when I came in, you were talking about Mendip need to provide houses. Well, there's a lot of houses going on in Froome, and they've been allocated, and it's unallocated land outside the development limit. So I know they haven't got a 5-year supply, but it has to tick a lot of boxes. And maybe that's why you're not putting a full application in, because you're testing the water at the expense of these people, I think.
Thank you. Can you?
I'm sorry, I'm conscious that I'm taking up the time, and some of those points I've already talked to, but in short, yes, a lot of people put in detailed applications, a lot of people put in outline applications. I think an outline application of 15, 20 years ago is very different to an outline application now. So when we put in an application, so that indicative plan that would be on screen, while there would likely be some evolution to that solution, if the outline was successful and a subsequent reserve matters application was brought forward, it does help the authority define parameters. So you can say, well, the housing should be in this part of the site, the drainage should be delivered in accordance with the principles of that drainage strategy, so the drainage solution we've got there. So a lot of the form of development would be secured through the parameters that would be granted at outline stage. What the things that you hold back on is about the precise look of the buildings, effectively, because you can have parameters on height granted at outline stage, so no 3-storey, down to 2-storey, whatever it may be, or you might have something where you'd say across the site, maximum AOD, so above ordnance datum. You can control an outline application, outline permission with those kind of principles, which can give a lot of confidence. It depends what your concerns are. So this is why this process and the planning application process.
My question was more around the pre-application.
Okay. Okay. So the starting point, obviously, it was a private process as far as I'm aware, but in terms of the principles of where we are, the authority recognise that there's a housing shortfall in terms of where they are in terms of 5-year supply, and they recognise that that would weigh in any development's favour, bringing forward residential housing in the locality as a point of principle. But then you look at the detail of the site, so their starting point is to identify the concerns that have previously been raised, as we've been discussing tonight, and say your challenge is to go and convince us that you've appropriately addressed those. So our application is seeking to address those. So we didn't get a point, and we weren't expecting one, where the authority said, great, submit an application and we'll rubber stamp it tomorrow, because that's not where they are, because they haven't gone through a full plan review. They haven't started to really look at those things about where the next layer of houses are coming. So it falls to planning applications to assess whether a development site is an appropriate release of land. So their starting point is you need to go and deal with the issues that have previously been raised and convince us that you've appropriately resolved them. And that's what we've tried to do.
No. Can we hear from this lady here first?
Can I just make 2 comments? When I look at the plan, whether it's allotted or proposed, I'm not sure how you call this, I'm just struck by the pedestrian access on the lane, which is connecting Enox Hill and Spring Gardens. It strikes me that the person who's created this plan hasn't got a clue really how narrow this lane is, and how can anybody access this as a pedestrian. It's so dangerous to walk just to get to Spring Gardens, and you're suggesting that there will be a pedestrian access. So I think that's a very important point to look at, how this is going to work. Maybe there will be some sort of lift or some kind of dropping from the sky. I'm not quite sure. You know, have you been to the site yourself?
Yes.
Yes. So you know that lane.
Yeah.
And you think that there could be a pedestrian access.
Well, I haven't walked it, no. But Charlotte has. What I would say is, in terms of an outline planning application, there's several elements that can be reserved for future approval. But in terms of sort of off-site highways, that would be something that's looked at as in terms of the outline. So the point at which you would access and how you would provide that pedestrian solution is something that's considered as part of the application. So when that's submitted, you'll be able to see precisely what those solutions are and how we would link into that. Obviously, they have to look at widths and on the UK transport system, the highways network, there's very detailed analysis about what those widths need to be as a minimum. So we need to respond to that, and that's what we've sought to do. So you'll be able to see the detail of it, and if you feel appropriate, challenge it.
And my second point was that because I live very near there, so the last house is called Charisma, which is on Enox Hill coming down. And that garden goes quite high up towards Packsaddle. I mean, if we can see the plan, I mean, I can show. Within one garden, you've got 4 gardens, which means that those properties will have tiny gardens. And I'm just really concerned about these people's mental health. because the houses, you know, obviously you want to fit as many houses as possible, and I'm not quite sure how many of these will be affordable. You're saying 20%? 30%. So what is 30% of 70? 21 houses. Right. So, but still, I think that I just wanted to make a comment that the gardens will be so tiny. You know, imagine that they will fit within one garden for one house. So just to make a point of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adam, behind, I think.
If I can just come up very briefly on the on gardens, obviously the authority, when you're putting in a detailed application, they will look at precisely how big they are, but they can there will be a requirement as to how, based on the size of the dwelling, the amount of amenity space they should have, and it also talks to the amount of play space, etc., that you might be delivering, the amount of public open space within your site. So there's sort of mathematical formulas that follow from that. So that's something that's set amended level.
Thanks. Adam?
Hi, thank you. I'm Adam Boyd, and I'm one of the district councillors for the adjacent College Ward, which covers Packsaddle Way. And I've seen this twice before. I mean, I think you can see by the level of interest in this room, I don't think there's many spare seats, how much interest there is in the community. A lot of people are watching online as well. You can't see how many there are. There's obviously a lot of concerns amongst the people of Packsaddle Way and that area, and the people of Inox Hill and Spring Gardens in that area. And I think if you look at my website, as Linda mentioned, there's two previous applications at my time as a councillor. There are several very strong reasons why the applications previously were withdrawn, why there were statutory and local objections to those, and I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced how many of those have been addressed in any proposals for 71 houses rather than 96 or 107, because the issues in principle will largely remain. I don't want to go through them all. Obviously, there's landscape, drainage, and access. And I'd like to push you on the point made by the lady in the front about footpath access along Inox Hill. If you're encouraging access on foot and say cycling onto Inox Hill, and people are going into Froome, at the moment there's no footway at all. The road goes around a bend, and you have to walk in the road and take your life into your hands. If you don't address that issue, then you're creating a death trap for people potentially who are stuck. Otherwise, they have to walk around the long route, Packsaddle Way. So I'm hoping that by now you will know whether there is a proposal to have a footway on the Inox Way, an off-site highway proposal. So if I can ask you to address that potentially, because otherwise it's not an accessible site. And that's probably one of the reasons why previously it wasn't deemed a sustainable site to develop in the local plan even. And the other issue I'd like to address is all ground conditions. It's a steep hill. I've heard from other long-term residents like Vic here that there's ground conditions on the site are likely to be very difficult, as other developers of houses on the top of the hill have found, which leads to a much greater intervention, much greater cost for foundation construction than they had ever anticipated. So, question for you: have you done any ground investigations, and can you confirm that the ground conditions aren't particularly difficult with the sort of rock there is and the slope that there is? Apart from those things, my main concern, apart from the landscape and the impact on the residents, is Wessex Water, the site. I can show you a map, a confidential map, so please don't share it, of the level of fly nuisance that people are having, including direct neighbours to this site to the south, affected in the Inox Hill and the lower Inox area particularly badly, with flies from the sewage works that they breed in there in the millions. This is over the last year or so up to now. Small black midges and gnats getting into people's homes, getting into people's gardens. It ruins people's quality of life. I would call that a statutory nuisance, only it hasn't got that far yet. We might need to take it that far later in the year. But Wessex Water are constantly are actually looking to net their site. It's undertaking a trial until June. We don't know whether that'll work. Wessex Water couldn't tell you whether it'll work. They don't know yet. They can't tell you whether netting the whole site would work. They can't tell you what else is needed, because they haven't got that far yet. So their objection would probably stand again to this application. So I think you should take it really seriously rather than try and say it's not an issue for us, it's an issue for the Wessex Water, because they objected to the previous development of Lower Inox, and now all the people in Lower Inox are having fly nuisance as a result of a housing developer building houses there and putting people in them. So that is effectively what you want to do to a en masse, a field adjacent to where the fly nuisance is at its worst. So this is it's a real problem. Now this is, so another question for you is, have you consulted Wessex Water? Because as far as I know, the manager of the plant, the man responsible for the area, wasn't aware of this before I told him. So I think that's, you could really look at that and come back on that, please. Two more brief questions. When will you be submitting a planning application? Is it tomorrow morning? Or are you giving yourself some time to reflect on what you've heard tonight? You'll probably hear from quite a few more people as well. So that's a question. And the last question, I think, well, is this the last time? Because I've seen two applications for this site in my time, in the last 10 years as a councillor. People who've lived here a long time have seen about 5 or 6. So is this the last time where an application for this many houses comes on site and generates this level of concern again? Maybe that you can ask your client that. Or will they one day give up? I'm on planning boards. I can't predetermine myself, but you can see I've got currently quite a lot of concerns. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Helpful. Definitely not dismissive of the fly issue. I think the point I was making that it's an ongoing solution that statutory provider should be looking to deal with, and the challenge for our application will be how advanced have those conversations got and the solutions they're trying to provide have got at the point where a decision, a determination of this application is being. Do we hold back on moving forward an application until that solution is in place, or do we start the conversation on everything else so that the timeline is progressing in the hope that they do their duty and find a solution? So my advice as a planning consultant to a prospective developer would always be there's lots of issues that were previously raised on this site that will all raise lots of challenges, and you're better to have those conversations and make sure, and if I'm honest, those conversations through pre-application are never as robust as through an application itself. So by submitting a planning application, there's a sensible conversation being had on all those fronts at the same time. And who knows, I mean, you have experience in the planning system, who knows what those timelines before you get to a decision may be. So the conversations start. I'm trying. Sorry, there were a lot of comments there, and I'm probably going to miss out lots. You mentioned ground conditions. There haven't been any specific assessments of ground conditions in terms of you're thinking about sort of boreholes and that kind of thing. So that hasn't been done. If that's required to inform the application, that will obviously come out during the course of the application. It's obviously not a requirement in terms of validation to submit. If we get told at that point that it's required, we'll have to reflect on that need and respond if we need to. Do you want to maybe jump out with just the topics and all? Okay. So I think that the Wessex Water position was well known. It was discussed through the pre-app, so I'm not sure where the authority were engaging directly. I don't know, Charlotte, whether you can remember. But because the issue is well known and we did research it, this site doesn't develop a new need for a solution. The solution exists and they're trying to progress it. They're not going to move it forward any more quickly if we're knocking on their door as opposed to existing residents. So I don't think there's much for us probably to be gained from pursuing that in earnest. But they will obviously be a statutory consultee during the planning application. In terms of will this be the last submission? Well, for one, that depends on the outcome of the application. But two, as I said earlier on, planning is an ever-evolving process. So if this application is unsuccessful and this site were then promoted through the next development plan review, then it would be considered based on the amount of houses needed to be delivered. Is it one of the preferred sites? If it isn't, then in 10, 15 years' time, there's a need to start from the council's perspective to review the entirety again. So a lot of the sites that were preferred this time round would go. That's why the planning system often revisits sites that have been previously looked at, because maybe they didn't get over the line last time, but when you look at them the next time round and you're required to find development sites, a lot of what was previously available has now gone and has been built out, and you've got a new period of time to look at, and so it's impossible to say that it wouldn't be looked at in the future. I think that probably covers most of them, but apologies if I've missed. Oh, apologies. Yeah. So in terms of a timeline, some of that depends on the consultation responses. So I think we're asking for responses over the next week. So those who've emailed us will be providing those the details tomorrow, so they've got a copy to hand. We'll also be waiting outside so the meeting can continue with other business. Charlotte and I will wait outside, and we can provide you with comments forms to be able to respond to, and sort of stamped envelopes, so you can provide, or you can email back to us, whichever you prefer. So if it raises issues that we've not previously considered and we think we need to, then that would impact our timelines. If it doesn't, we'd be looking to submit in April.
Okay. And then I've got a lady here as well.
Not tomorrow. Not tomorrow. Yeah.
Gentlemen. Do you have a view on the length of Packsaddle Way? Because my understanding was it's already longer than the emergency services like, and you're intending to make it even longer.
I'm not transport specialist. I'm a town planner, so I'd say I'd leave that to our transport statement to address. But they've obviously, as part of the consulting team, already considered whether they think it's appropriate, and they're convinced that it is. One of the things that you look at is the length of those routes, but also other opportunities. If there's single points of access, so if you're looking at single points of access, other opportunities in the event of risk, and looking at what those risk events might be, how you would deal with those. Are there other solutions out there? But as I say, I'm not a transport specialist, so I won't comment on that in any more detail.
Okay, just
lady here.
I agree with everything that's been said. I just wonder, who are the developers, and can we see their track record?
Well, the applicants will be known when we submit. So they're developers that develop across the country, and you'll be able to see their track record. So well, it's an individual. So my direct client is Brian Spencer, and so and they have a development business as well. Yes. Potentially, but obviously that's something that would be resolved in the future.
Brown Spencer. Brian.
Yes, he's not an individual owner. I don't know the precise details of the land ownership structure, but he's part of the family.
That's quite interesting, because when Jill Spencer was on the farm with her husband, who unfortunately died now, I understand, but she used that land, or part of the land, she had it roped off, and was quite the, what's the TV program that used to be on, the Good Life?
All right, can we go to this lady here who's been waiting to ask a question?
I just want to make one final comment about the fly situation. I've lived in Enox Hill for 22 years. I'm sure many people here have lived there longer. And there have been flies in Enox Hill flying up from the sewage works all that time, and they haven't found a solution. What you're talking about is adding 71 houses to that problem, detrimental, as Adam said, to their quality of living. So, you know, it's a long, incredibly long-standing problem. The likelihood of that being solved, you know, in 2 months is as I said, very unlikely. So,
Thank you. I think there's two things to timeline. One is the point at which you're making a planning decision, and that might not be in 2 months' time. And the other is what's the solution at that point in time, and the timeline for delivery of that solution. So that timeline will be by the decision maker, whether that be the council or an appeal. That would be, the decision maker would have to look at those solutions in the timeline, and is there a realistic prospect of a viable solution being put in place by the point of time where there would be occupancy. Because obviously the point where you make your decision...
I'm suggesting there won't be.
No, and I understand that, and I understand the concerns, but there's a timeline of building out as well. So that's something for the decision maker to have a look at.
Can I take just a couple more questions from the room, because time is going on, if there's any few more questions from the room, because I know there's some questions online that we need to deal with as well. So if there are any questions that we haven't already raised, anything a bit different that people want to raise? Sir? You just take the microphone, please, so people online can hear.
I was just interested if you were able to tell us roughly how much the landowner might be able to make from the on the land.
As a planning consultant, definitely not my area of expertise. So. We've got some questions online which we'll just quickly run through as well, and then we'll go to the councillors.
So some of them are more comments than questions, but I'll go through them as quickly as I can. So the first two are from Helen Kay, who is also a Mendip District Councillor. Her comment earlier on in the discussion. So if we really need this housing, why aren't they packed on more densely? These look like 3 and 4 bedroom houses for middle classes. We need more terraces and semis so youngsters and ordinary people can really afford them. There's no allotments either, so hardly a sustainable development. She goes on to say, my question relates to general good practice when building on greenfield sites, so as not to waste good soil and the next field, etc. Regarding sustainability, is there any intention to have passive house standards or any renewables on site?
Sorry, I'll come back to that. I suppose the first point on density, what we look at on density, there's a challenge in planning to make best use of land. So if you are going to develop, so the point that's been made, if you are going to develop a site, develop it an appropriate density so that there isn't a need to go and develop further greenfield. So that I think, but what we have to do is balance that between looking at the local context, and the point was made about garden space and what's happening in the local area. I respond to that. There's also in terms of landscape impact and how densely you're filling. So obviously an urban site would have a very different context to an edge of town site. So we feel that the number of units proposed here is an appropriate balance to those various issues. In terms of sustainability and saying no allotments on site, except there's not the site scale, we've looked to deliver public open space at an appropriate amount. The site isn't of a scale which lends itself to significant delivery of allotments. You tend to look to provide those on more strategic sites where you can provide enough so there's an economy of scale. And then finally, in terms of sustainable credentials, we were looking to work to a policy compliance scheme, so that would be, so passive house would go well beyond that.
Thanks.
So the next, again, I think there are more comments, are from Michael Dunk, who is also a Mendip District Councillor. So he says, the question of the sewage works fire problem is not looking like it will be resolved anytime soon without a breakthrough in the design of the sewage works like the one in Froome. To approve an application for houses here would be an abdication of duty to any prospective future residents of the site. On the subject of housing need and prices, there is no link in Froome between increasing house numbers and any reduction in market prices. The argument about housing need here is more about the need for 1, 2 and 3 bedroom social housing only. I predict that this application will not be welcomed by those in Froome who cannot afford new housing being built presently. And lastly, he says, therefore, the loss of productive farming land to mostly market-priced housing outside the development boundary in this sensitive landscape area is not, in my opinion, justified.
Thank you, Michael. Lizzie, did you have some questions, comments?
Thanks, Steve. So I'm Lizzie Boyle. I'm a town councillor here in Froome, responsible looking after College Ward as well. Really, I'm probably just doing kind of Steve's thing now, of thanking people. I really want to thank everybody who's come along to put their points across and to do it so passionately, but also respectfully. I think that's been really important. And it's what we come to expect to a certain extent from people who live in Froome. Like Adam, I can imagine that this has been incredibly frustrating for people who've lived in that area for a long period of time, to just see this come up over and over and over again. And each time it gets turned down, you're just going to have to keep getting ready for the next time, I think. I think that's, steel for it. At least that's, even though it's, well.
Let's make a point, though. It wasn't actually turned down. It continually gets withdrawn.
Okay, it gets withdrawn.
With an application, I think, and we see it through to its fruition this time, so it does get declined.
Hey. I'd also like to thank Garrett and Charlotte, because theirs is not an easy job, and these can be quite difficult environments to come into. So I'd like to really thank you for the patience you've shown in responding to the questions, the thoughtfulness you've shown. Far be it from me to suggest that perhaps your heart isn't in this project, but perhaps your heart isn't in this project. Thank you for the guidance that you have offered on how to raise concerns and how to put in appropriate challenges. For me, the big things that I'm worried about, which, those who are taking notes, take notes, access. One road in that goes through a loop-de-loop, kind of Packsaddle Way, very long street. The pedestrian access point that you've made. The traffic impacts not just on Packsaddle, but on some of the lanes, and some of the narrow roads. A couple of years ago, gosh, maybe even longer than that now, we had long discussions at this committee about the potential for the Lilies cidery was the word that was used, which was one industrial building, medium, slightly larger scale than we thought it would be, and two houses in land near there. And we talked about that for a long time and said, that's not what we want on this bit of green space in this area. It all connects together, because that's not, people value this green space, people value this agricultural land and amenity space and walking space and so forth. So I worry about the precedent that this sets. I worry that you start to develop here, and then it's the next field and the next field. We're seeing that, but we're seeing that on the other side of town. We're going to have conversations about that very shortly, I think. So it's, where do we go from this one? If this goes through, where do you go from this one? So I commend you for kind of defending your neighbourhood, your space, absolutely. I recognise it's great that somebody's coming forward and saying, we'll do 30% affordable housing. The point Michael made it far better, actually, because he's had time to write it down rather than just scribbling about what the housing need is. But it's outside the development boundary. It's precedent for mission creep, for grabs of the next field. The access issues, I think, are atrocious. It's just not good when that comes through. I also think there's a lot of language in this where it's talking about the authority. And the authority sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. The authority is planning authority, which is currently Mendip District Council. In a year's time, it will change because of the unitary thing, so it will become Somerset County Council. So the authority is not, sorry, not Somerset County, Somerset Council, I stand corrected, thank you, Linda. The authority is not some nameless, faceless thing. It's something that we choose who's on it. We elect people to be on it. They represent us, the community, and our voices. So use those who you've chosen to represent you, to represent your voice in that. The authority also can only respond to what the developer puts in their application. It's not their job to design developments, it's the developer's job. They design things, and the authority, the council, says yay or nay, according to planning policy. So I think, you know, let's also, with Savills, you know, recognise that you guys have a duty as well, and a responsibility as well, to put in something that is worthy of Froome, and that it's going to make it hard for Froome to say no. But I'm on your side, so that's it. Ramble over. This might be my last planning meeting, so, you know, ramble over.
Thank you, Liz. I don't know if you want to come back on anything on that, or...
No, just to say thank you, everyone, for your time. I appreciate
Hang on, I'm going to say that first.
I was going to say, I appreciate these are complicated things. Just a reminder that we will still wait outside, so if you would like to take any questions with you, we're always interested to hear your responses. I mean, the preference for us would be to email if you can, and hopefully you've got the email address. If not, do we have it to hand for people to take down?
Well,
I can definitely ask the question if you want me to feed that one back. I think the answer to the challenge usually with those things are, would you give up your own your own land?
Is the owner in this room tonight?
Could I just want to, from my perspective, say some comments from my what I've been writing down and what I think about this. I think this whole development is purely speculative in nature. I don't think it gives anything back to the town. It's taking advantage of this so-called lack of 5-year housing plan. As everyone said, it's not in the local plan. And likewise, I think there's a lot of other people who said, I'm really worried, and as Lizzie said, really worried about if this goes through, then what is the future prospect of the rest of the fields in Pack Saddle? You know, we spent a lot of time fighting off the previous development of the cidery to maintain historic fields that are farmed in a historic way, and this would be the thin end of the wedge from what I can see. I think the links to the town are very poor. It's all very well building 30% affordable housing, but 30% unaffordable housing on the outskirts of town location is of no use to anyone as far as I'm concerned. All it's going to do is promote lots of cars, lots of traffic, and yeah, it just doesn't work for the town. And the flies issue is an issue that's right here and right now, and that needs to be solved before any development is done on any site around that area, because it's not going to go away. It's been around for God knows how many years, and it's getting worse. And to say, oh, it's a statutory thing, all that will mean, as far as I'm concerned, is that whoever builds the houses just throws the problem onto someone else and walks away with a lovely profit. And I think that's absolutely wrong. And finally, the whole subject of outline planning and you know, full plan. I do agree with Councillor over in the corner. You know, that we all know, we've all seen these developments. Once outline planning's given, it's carte blanche to the developers to do what they want. They get a free rein to do anything. So personally, I'd like to see everything on the upfront before, so everyone can have a comment and think about it accordingly. Two last things. I'd like to talk to the gentleman about the hedgerows actually before you leave, because if they have been removed, then I think that could be a problem. So I'd like to have a little bit more detail about the hedgerows. And I think the schools aspect is a very interesting one as well, because I wasn't aware of that either. So I think that's also something that we can follow up on. That's my comments. Hang on. Jane's got something?
Well, it's just a comment really. Firstly, I know you've said to everybody that you'll be outside to talk to them. I hope you don't mean literally outside. You're welcome to use the foyer downstairs so that people don't freeze. And secondly, clearly the feedback that you've had from the meetings, you know, tonight hasn't been positive. But from the town council's perspective, and what we do say to all developers is that yes, we would still like to, you know, have a dialogue with you. Just because what you've heard hasn't been positive doesn't mean to say that we're not still prepared to talk to you and work things through. There is always a danger that applications can get approved. And if that's the case, then we would want to work towards a point where it's the best development it could be. But so that offer's there. Just, you know, it's not positive, I know, but we would like to carry on talking with you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Sorry, go on, one last question before everyone leaves. If you don't.
Anybody wants to be linked to the Paxsaddle email address, come see me after now.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll take a few minutes break, then we've got to finish the rest of our meeting. Thank you. Right, so the rest of the meeting, I need to do some statutory stuff that I realise I haven't done yet. To agree, apologies, absence received, please, Hannah.
So we've received apologies from Sheila Gore, Mark Dorrington and Rich Ackroyd.
Right, do we have to vote on these times? We do, so if someone could propose these, Lizzie, and I'll second, and I don't know where Paul is. Can we have to wait for Paul?
We do have to wait.
For Paul. Okay, let's go on to the any declaration of members' interests. No, we'll get Paul when he comes back as well on that one. To agree the minutes of the meeting. Oh, we have to wait for Paul on that one as well. Where is he? I'll go and find him.
He's coming now, I can see him.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. I was just trying to run through the others and I realised I couldn't do it because you weren't here, so we couldn't vote. So first thing we have apologies of absence from.
Sheila Gore, Mark Dorrington, and Rich Ackroyd.
So thank you, Lizzie. I'll second and all in favour. Thank you very much. Any declaration of members' interest from anybody? No interest. And to agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of March, which I did have somewhere here, which I know we've all seen. So if someone could propose those for me, thank you, Lizzie. And second by Paul. And thank you very much. And that's all passed. Right. Item 7 on the agenda to agree to consider the major planning applications received, and we have Chris Marsh from Wayne Homes. Are you from Wayne Homes, Chris?
Chris Marsh from Pegasus.
Sorry.
On behalf of,
so we'll do that one first, and then this gentleman on 2-3 Windsor who's been waiting so patiently and who's got another bit to wait. I'm very sorry about this, sir. Thank you. Do you want to just introduce?
Yes. So this is application number 808 on our list. It's for land at Little Kiefford Lane and Froome. It's an application by Wayne Homes for the erection of 70 dwellings, open space, ecological mitigation land, drainage and landscaping, including vehicular access. So you may recall that we have seen this application previously, and that application was refused and is currently at appeal. Previously, when we responded, we actually responded to all 3 of the Kiefford sites within the allocation area, and our main issues were the access onto Little Kiefford Lane, the lack of a comprehensive master plan, the lack of pedestrian, vehicular, cycling connectivity throughout the sites, and sustainability of the buildings, and the fact that we didn't want to see connection to the gas grid. So that covered all 3 sites, but essentially because we were looking for them to be master planned. The other 2 sites have been through Mendit's Planning Board and are subject, or will be approved subject to I think it's section 106 being signed, and some of the there were a few issues that have been delegated to the planning officer to sort out before any approvals were issued. But essentially they've been approved, and this application now completes the rest of that master planned site. So yeah, if we can hear from Chris now.
Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I shall endeavour to be quick about this one. I appreciate that obviously the site has plenty of history, which I'm no doubt you're well aware of, and I also try not to repeat anything that you've heard in the relatively recent past from David Wilson's, who will have kind of gone over some of those strategic level points. So if we just go to the next slide, and I'll just run over the key changes, really, I think is probably what we should be focusing on. So I suppose the big one is the relocation of the vehicular access onto the mount. That's in line with the most recent Barrett David Wilson master plan, and that access has been designed to work with existing and proposed accesses off of the mount, including Dragonfly Close. That in turn has moved the access from Little Kiefford Lane. That is now to be provided as a pedestrian and cycle link. Promoting those movements through the site. Probably also worth noting that the link to the south has also been configured as a similar spec cycle and pedestrian link, tying up with the public open space, which you can't see it on the layout, and I don't think we have anything in the presentation, but that public open space is effectively split either side of that hedgerow with the outline David Wilson parcel to the south. In terms of design, we heard loud and clear the kind of stakeholder comments on particularly the house types and materials and detailing, and there have been some significant revisions with the new design team in that respect. We've also revisited, you've heard in terms of sustainability from Jane's synopsis at the outset there. We've revisited the energy strategy from the outset, meaning better building performance and additional renewable energy, but we'll come on to that further down the presentation. So just to briefly look at the access, this quite frantic diagram up on screen is the proposed junction layout onto the mount. Worth noting that includes pedestrian crossing, a right turn lane with a pavement footway turning that corner with ground-mounted markers for ease of use to provide connectivity to the existing provision there. It also involves relocating the speed limit further south, appreciating that as a gateway to Froome, we're effectively kind of moving that southward. I think that's probably all I need to say, having already mentioned, obviously, the footway and cycleway link onto Little Kiefford Lane. So in terms of the layout principles, again, as I say, this is in line with the Barrett David Wilson master plan that was amended and, as you've heard, accepted in the relatively recent past by MENDIP in their resolutions in respect of their full and outline applications. So that includes the relocated access, which in turn starts to dictate how some of that layout works, but that has resulted, I think, beneficially in the light of some of the comments we've received from stakeholders in a less kind of circular highways configuration within the site, a principal and perhaps more formalised east-west route through that initial section, and then subsidiary roads, including shared surfaces, leading from that. In terms of character and density, the plan up on screen at the moment shows the division between the slightly higher density area in the northern part of the site, as shown on the master plan, and the more suburban, lower density parcel sort of further south, integrating more with the open space play and strategic landscaping. It's been informed also by a strong principle of maximising hedgerow retention and enhancing that wherever we can. That's obviously assisted by the alterations to the Kiefford Lane junction. And also in terms of the breakthrough to the south, we've been able to maximise the retention of that hedgerow and do away with things like street lighting in that breakthrough. That in turn means that there's very much a kind of naturalised setting to the site boundary, approaching from the south until one arrives more or less at the engineering works associated with the access. At that point, greater street presence from the dwellings orientated onto that space, and also their attendant sort of boundary treatments and so on. There's also been an emphasis on the provision of public open space and critically integrated public open space that both ties in with the access and movement hierarchy, the sustainable drainage, the play area, and obviously the equivalent, let's say, area of formalised public open space on the southern side of that southern boundary within the David Wilson parcel. And I think I've probably already touched on some of this, yeah, just to reiterate that obviously the landscaping scheme has been revised accordingly and in line with relatively recent government planning policy statements. We've been busy adding as many street trees as we can reasonably accommodate on the site, particularly in terms of the principal routes, and ensuring that that works with the development hierarchy. Where we don't have so many trees will be some of the areas that are constrained by engineering works, particularly in terms of below ground attenuation crates, looking at the parking for plot 3 as I say this, but generally speaking, trees along street frontages and focal points of the maintained public open space, which will fall to a management company in the long term. We've also undertaken an updated ecology survey to understand our baseline and our requirements there, and those ecology corridors also inform that landscaping strategy, particularly in terms of hedgerow and appropriate buffers to that, to ensure that those can be maintained in their optimum condition. So to the design principles, as I mentioned, there's been a significant overhaul in this respect. We understand that stakeholders locally were perhaps not as enamoured with the design approach that was agreed on with the local authority at the last outing, and therefore the blocks have been arranged in a much more articulated form in terms of groups of dwellings. That was a criticism previously. It's universally 2-storey across the site now, doing away with the couple of 2.5 stories that we had in previously. An emphasis on traditional detailing and simplified materials. It is recon stone with some render for the most part. There are a couple of garage blocks where brick is to be used, but that's the only brick now within the material palette for the site. An emphasis on pitched roofs, simplicity. Some of the window and door surrounds that we see around Froome have been picked up in the detailing. We've also looked at accessibility, and that informs a lot of the hierarchy around parking areas and their relationship to things like garden access, private cycle storage, and safety and security. We've also worked on the housing mix, and that is now closely aligned with the mix from both the Mendip-wide housing market assessment, but also the Froome subset of that, which does differ quite significantly from the wider picture, which is perhaps unsurprising, as it encapsulates all the kind of rural hinterland. So we're content that we have a good housing mix that incorporates 30% affordable housing, the mix of which we've already agreed with local authority housing officers. And in terms of those design principles, again, I would just mention that there is an emphasis on securing an appropriate balance and relationship between private and public green spaces. As I mentioned at the top, energy, we understand that it was a particular concern last time, and indeed it was embodied in the reasons for refusal. The best I could do by way of images from the pack was to use this stock image from the house builder's brochure. So this, unfortunately, is the only image that doesn't bear directly to the development as proposed. But in line with the David Wilson parcels, and in contrast to previous proposals, we are now integrating photovoltaic panels on the new units. And I think, in fairness, the layout has enabled us to do that with a more strong east-west orientation that then gives more useful south-facing slopes. The buildings are dual aspect, thus giving cross ventilation and ironing out some of the peaks and trough in our ever-changing weather, as we've experienced today. All buildings with on-plot parking, that is to say garage or allocated on-plot parking, will be provided with EV charging. Obviously, the application is accompanied by a travel plan which sets out measures for sustainable travel, and we will also be making contributions as reasonably justified by the local authority and indeed the Highway Authority in terms of local sustainable travel. Broadband provision will of course be a standard, obviously given the dramatically changing working patterns of the past couple of years. We don't see the reliance on home working from going away anytime soon, and obviously that has a knock-on effect for transport demand. I've very broadly headed this energy strategy, but it obviously goes through to the minimisation of waste, measures for on-plot sorting and collection of recycling, and measures for water efficiency to reduce waste once we're into the occupational phase, but also obviously in terms of construction practices. We would be looking at a construction management plan that provided for the appropriate sorting and disposal of construction waste. Thanks. The drainage strategy, at the top I went through what has changed. What has not changed fundamentally is the drainage strategy. The point at which we arrived in the course of the previous application with the local flood authority and with the local planning authority was that as a physical system, the drainage strategy that we've presented, which is an independent self-supporting strategy, does work, that it's appropriate. The way it crept into a reason for refusal was on a point of integration, but we feel that obviously that needs to be read in the round with the other ways in which the proposals are connected and integrated with the other proposals. Things like circulation of movement and integration of cycle links and such like, we consider to be the real thrust of that policy point, and it's far more important that we have a deliverable drainage solution that we know works. So it's based on an infiltration methodology, draining to the lowest point of the site, where there will be an infiltration basin that is flanked by swales, which will provide A, overflow storage, and B, attenuation, and C, a degree of passive water treatment. The system itself is designed to obviously manage the currently uncontrolled runoff from the site, but that takes into account a climate change allowance to future-proof it against more extreme future events, which I think we can all assume will be increasingly the norm. Being an on-site basin and Britain being the country it is, we expect that there will be some benefits for ecology, with certainly a fairly reasonably reliable level of a degree of water in that pond. May also have some incidental recreational use as part of that open space, being designed to a fairly shallow gradient, but that will all be supported separately on the foul drainage side by a water pumping station in the event that there is an extreme weather event that would otherwise compromise the foul sewage system.
Did I go too far? No.
And I'd invite any questions. I'm afraid that was a whistle-stop tour, but
thanks very much, Chris.
That gives
Thank
you
you.
some context.
Questions, please. Paul, Lizzie, I don't know if there's anything on. Is Rich and Sheila still with us?
Yeah,
all right, okay.
I've got 4 people online as well, attendees.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's quite a lot. Firstly, I have to kind of commend the improvements to the plan, because there are definitely improvements. I think the access off the mount and the cycle access to Little Kiefford, etc., are definitely improvements. I mean, the fact that there wasn't cycle provision before is quite incredible, really, in this day and age, but at least it's there to some degree now. However, it's still super car-centric. It's still a typical 20th century suburban layout, which promotes driving, and it doesn't discourage anyone from driving. There's parking spaces right outside everyone's houses. There's the proposals for the mount are admittedly an improvement, but it's still car bias, if you like. Personally, I think that part of the problem with the mount is that there isn't any footway, and there's not enough width for a cycle lane, etc., etc. Therefore, we need to take a lane away from the cars. We don't need to just force pedestrians and cycles to go completely different routes. So I know this is not just down to your development. This is really a master plan thing, and some of these developments have already been approved. So in some ways, it's a bit late in the day, but this is still a problem. This is an ongoing problem for all these developments. They're still far too car-centric. What else is there? The house, the design, the house typology, if you like. Apparently, well, I think we made some comments, and I know the Civic Society made a lot of comments. And as far as the Civic Society is concerned, not many of their comments have been addressed. So I'm not quite sure exactly what's changed. But again, from a personal point of view, it's pastiche, backward-looking house design, which maybe some people like. Maybe that sells houses, but as far as I'm concerned, it's backward-looking. I'd like to see much different. And I think the Civic Society, in some senses, are sympathetic to that. They'd like to see kind of sympathy with existing architecture in the town. But what else to say? I mean, I think the street scenes. One of the things about the layout is that it's very what's the word? Kind of they're largely detached. The dwellings aren't particularly attached. There's no community sense, if you like. There's no focal point for a community. That's a suburban layout, so there's no kind of focal point. And I think that's really well demonstrated in the street scenes, which shows kind of quite large gaps between dwellings, and some of them there's a kind of dominance of detached and semis, kind of suburban semis, and not very much of kind of terraced housing or smaller type housing. What else did I pick up from the? Interestingly, on one of your slides, you mentioned pedestrian and cycle priority. You didn't speak to that at all, I don't think, but I wondered what you meant by that. That may just be a kind of throwaway term. Play area. The play area is, again, is still on the edge of the development. It's not particularly accessible to most people, and is certainly not well overlooked by housing. So it's a bit kind of tucked away. I think that's significance of design, sustainable travel. Yeah, sustainable travel promotion, again, is kind of one of those throwaway things that developers use, which is slightly meaningless, because if the layout still promotes car use, then it doesn't matter what you do to promote sustainable travel. People won't travel actively because it's much easier to jump in their cars. And I think the last thing, you talked about the energy changes in terms of energy efficiency, etc. There's no mention of building fabric, so I wonder if you could kind of mention that, because that's obviously a key element of building fabric. There was a mention of the orientation of the housing for solar gain, but of course, as we move into climate change, actually, we might not want solar gain. We might actually want to be preventing too much solar gain. So again, that needs to be addressed as well. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Paul. I don't know if you want to come back on any of those comments, or sure,
I happily will, if that's okay. I mean, firstly, in respect of junction design, layout, and car centricity, I certainly don't disagree with you in terms of highway design being led by private vehicle usage. That's top of the list for highways engineers, of which I'm mercifully not one. But I don't disagree that it is a case of fitting appropriate cycle and pedestrian provision around a kind of a very rigid framework for manoeuvring vehicles, and that's how these things shape up. We also have to meet adopted parking standards, which include visitor parking, and make sure that that's provided in a way that's safe, secure, convenient, doesn't result in parking courts, which we know aren't preferred from a kind of safety and security kind of perspective, and that does place a requirement inevitably across the built envelope of the site to accommodate those car movements. I mean, I appreciate your scepticism on travel plan measures. There are active measures in there, and I say there are contributions to sustainable travel. I mean, in terms of car use, obviously there is the move towards supporting electric vehicle charging, with the encouraging that if cars are to be used, they might be a little bit more sustainable in their nature. But I think that's a fair point to make. Also, in terms of the pedestrian cycle priority, I can probably clarify that a little bit, as well as providing more in the way of active links, for example, through the alterations to the link to the south. There's also a lesser extent of kind of principal, very highly engineered highway, and a move towards those secondary routes with shared surfaces, which in turn will serve to effectively passively give more control to cyclists and passively reduce vehicle speeds and awareness of users on bikes and on foot. To what extent that changes patterns of behaviour is, I suppose, a different matter, but I think it does make an active contribution to encouraging or at least supporting those means of transport. I mean, I take the points in terms of the house type pack. I think it's fair to say it's always a difficult balance to balance modern building standards with something that is not going to ape, but is going to be sympathetic to a very distinctive local vernacular, as you have in Froome. I think it's probably a town that stands out for having a very unique kind of range around some kind of key characteristics. And it's always the designer's an enviable job to try and reflect that. I do feel that we have progressed matters in that respect, but I do take the point. And I think that probably goes for the street scenes as well. We have a master plan that does kind of point towards balancing a quantum of 70 units, which is the minimum for the allocation for totting up the 3 parcels, and the densities that we are working to. In terms of kind of the smaller units, I think we're up at 72% 2 and 3 bed units, and we do have semi-detached and short terraced units within that layout. But I appreciate obviously in certain areas of the site the densities do move towards a greater focus on detached units. And I think finally, just a couple more, in terms of the play location, it's tied in with the open space, which is in turn tied in with strategic landscaping with the adjoining parcel and the sustainable drainage. We feel that does and has previously given a sufficient balance of achieving the mandatory standoff distance, which I think is 20 metres to the property boundary of the nearest property, for people that really don't like the noise of playgrounds, which seems quite a petty concern to me personally. But and obviously providing the kind of passive surveillance that you naturally want for that kind of use. And finally, in terms of building fabric, I can probably unpack that one a little bit more. Where we are currently is that we are scheduled for a 34% reduction on energy usage against the baseline 2013 Part L building regulations, which is effectively the baseline for the purposes of policy. So we are going essentially over and above policy requirement in that respect. And it's not to a passive house specification, but it does make a meaningful contribution supported by the other energy generation measures and energy efficiency measures that we're looking to introduce.
Chris. Lizzie, and then I think Helen Kay would like to ask a few questions. So over to you, Lizzie.
Thank you. I'll start with the lament while I formulate my questions. My lament is that we've been talking about these sites, your site and, sorry, Wayne Holmes sites, not yours, and the David Wilson Homes fields for a long time. And we have talked for much of that time about the need to have a comprehensive kind of road layout and connections to the main roads. And it has taken all of that time, it feels, for that to be recognised and for the change in the access point away from Little Kiefford Lane to the Mount. And it feels like we could have agreed that 18 months ago and then got on to some other stuff. So that's my lament. I'm sad that it has taken that long for us to get to the point when it was pretty clear that that was where we were going to end up. Lament over. Question. Question for Jane. Yes.
Wake up.
Which you can kind of draw a response. But what's the latest from the Friends of Little Kiefford in terms of their responses to the new proposals? You don't have to answer that just yet, or you can answer it now if you want.
I haven't seen it.
Okay.
But I can, while you're talking, I can see whether or not anything has been posted in the meantime.
Thank you. Other things, the new building regulations, 2021 building regulations, when they come in, will require a 30% uplift on the 2013 building regulations in terms of energy performance and carbon reduction. So thank you for the extra 7%. On-plot EV charging will be a requirement of the brand new building regulations when they come in. So it's exciting that you're doing it, but it's a compliance thing. The solar PV is great. Thank you for including that. It obviously helps to address a very important issue for many people, which is rising energy costs, as well as the environmental issues associated with our energy system and carbon emissions and so forth. So thank you for that. Again, I note that the new building regulations and the way that energy is treated allows for solar PV to be part of the package. And that's a sort of new thing. So again, I'm glad that you're on it with your compliance. As Paul said, there's not really anything there about insulation. There's definitely not anything in there that tells me you're doing anything radical on heating. So potentially you're just kind of putting in gas boilers that are going to have to come out in 10 years' time and be replaced by heat pumps at the expense of, you know, to the expense of the householder. When there's a really nice economy that comes from PV and heat pumps going in at the same time to the expense of the developer. I did do a bit of a reminder to myself about Wayne Holmes' sustainability strategy. And I reminded myself by remembering and checking again that I couldn't actually find it. And I also looked for Wayne Group's sustainability strategy, and I couldn't find that either. I may be bad at Googling, but again, this is, you don't work for them, you kind of work for them. Frustrating, again, to see people who are able to come into different towns around the country and develop and not have anything in place that says, this is our goal, this is how we see ourselves positively contributing to the environment. So yeah, I'm frustrated. What were my questions? There was going to be a question in there somewhere. The question for Jane, which I've asked, and then, yeah, the question around heating.
Can I answer that now? That there are no comments have been posted from Friends of Little Kiefford at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah. And I haven't had any direct discussions with them at this point.
Okay. Is this a stage of the process where they will have an opportunity to come back in and kind of make their comments? Yeah. Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's probably really the point over heating that I need to come back on. Yes, the strategy is gas boilers at this point in time, and I think I don't recall, you've probably heard from David Wilson previously, the chapter and verse on the background to that is there's a combination of grid capacity limitations in this location, but I think it's also relevant at this point in time that air source heat pumps are a risky option in terms of occupiers given the running costs and the exorbitant cost of electricity at the moment. You know, it's obviously digressing somewhat, is slightly depressing that it takes a major conflict for the government to rethink how it generates electricity for the grid. But it looks like that will change in the coming years, and that will probably bring with it the improvements to start supporting these technologies at a domestic level. I think we've probably been over the background to that, and yes, you're quite right. The 2021 building regs are certainly a significant step up, and we will be exceeding those by a certain amount. And yeah, I mean, in terms of electric vehicle charging, yeah, I appreciate entirely that might all be overrun by events, but we're proposing this in the context of an adopted development plan and the standards as they are today, and that's how it will fall to be considered by officers and district councillors. In terms of a kind of a corporate approach to energy strategy, that's one of those things that is what it is, but obviously each site is different and will generate its own energy strategy, and that has been the case with a local focus in this instance.
Okay, thanks. I know Helen wants to say something, and then Rich Ackroyd. So, Anna, could you let Helen in?
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Hello, Chris. Chris and I have had long telephone calls before as well. I've got one big problem with it and one thing that I would like a clarification on, Chris, because it looks as if you've done something quite positive. So on the west side, one of the reasons why it got refused at planning board was because we didn't want to lose the hedgerow there. And as we discussed on the telephone, looks like you're still proposing to take out half the hedgerow on that west side and put in some houses where the bungalows end, to put in some houses that face Little Kiefford Lane. And then you've got the pedestrian route going on to Little Kiefford Lane, and then you've got the other houses, 3 more, that then face into the development site. And so their back gardens face onto Little Kiefford Lane. And we discussed on our call about this, whether or not it really needed to have what's called an active frontage there. And my feeling is that with a slight revision of the layout, and you might lose a house or two, which I know you won't like, you could have all the back gardens going up against the hedgerow on Little Kiefford Lane, and you could keep that hedgerow. So that's my first comment. That's sort of my negative comment. My positive comment on the other side, when we had our telephone call, on the side where you've got the access now, which I really am so pleased about, that it's coming out on the B3092. We will lose some hedgerow there, but it was either one or the other. And what we did talk about was whether we could have some pedestrian. You're going to put in some pavements, and I haven't got the map in front of me, but I seem to remember when I glanced at it that you do have those pavements in now, and one of them goes south from the access road all the way along the, it sort of guides people into the open space, which is great. The other one looks as if it goes all the way up to the northeast corner of the site, and then as you know from when we had the meeting, you might have watched it online where we talked about the master plan and the David Wilson Homes application, we suggested that there could be some road engineering north of the actual your site, because people will walk along that road. We are concerned about people walking along that road, and that pavement could be extended further up towards the mount where the shops are. Now, we don't think we can put pavements all the way up there, but can you just tell us what your most recent thinking is about that? And am I right in thinking that there will be pavements now along the eastern edge of your site? Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Kay. Yeah, appreciate in respect to that first point, that is something that we've discussed previously, we have looked at reconfiguring that area, primarily due to the constraints of access and manoeuvring, providing adequate parking and so on. We feel we do need to have those units at the northwest corner orientated onto Little Kiefford Lane. Obviously, the emphasis has been on retaining as much hedgerow as we can, and in particular, retaining as much continuity with the hedgerow as it extends further south. To kind of maintain that structure, also as it becomes, I think, steadily more rural in feel towards the south along Little Kiefford Lane, to try and reflect that character as best we can. Yes, we will lose some hedgerow as a result, more than simply punching through for the pedestrian link, but that does allow for things like the pedestrian visibility displays, which do account for a certain amount of that loss. In respect to the access to the east, we do have the footway and crossing improvements that turn the corner around that access. I mean, yes, also in terms of kind of connectivity within the site, we've worked hard on that to try and integrate those public realm areas. We don't want a scheme where those are very fragmented and unappealing in terms of getting to them. In respect of extending the pavement further northward, I mean, it's something that I think will need to be looked at by the respective engineers at the local highway authority and our own consultants. Certainly, if it were something that were considered necessary, there are the mechanisms in place either through Section 278 agreements or potentially Section 106 to secure additional works in that respect. But I think it's something that will fall to the respective engineers to resolve between themselves.
Thanks for that, Chris. Richard Ackroyd, Councillor.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Chris, for waiting so long and being so patient. Thank you for the presentation. I think you have made a lot of improvements to this scheme. I won't prolong this because it's a long night already. I was going to make most of my points have been raised already. I want to major on the transport plan. I noticed in the transport plan you still got 50% more or less car use as envisaged. And I just wonder, and I noticed also that highways haven't signed off that plan yet. At what point would they need to sign that plan off? And do you think are you happy with that plan? Is that in your mind good enough? For example, would you get a bus to turn around somewhere on the estate if ever there was a bus locally? I mean, so it's a question about the transport plan. If changes were needed on that plan, would you be prepared to do it? And I'm thinking of locally, there's been a couple of instances where transport plans have not been signed off by the developer sort of 5 years after they were written, and they're still not signed off now. So that's a concern for me. But the question is about transport plan, and have you heard back yet from highways?
Thank you, Councillor Ackroyd. In terms of whether we've heard back, no, not as yet. I think the comment on the web portal at the moment is simply a holding response saying that they will respond. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously as an outline document, it's something that is part of the submission, and it will fall to the local planning authority and the local highway authority to assess whether that is adequate, whether it meets the policy requirements, and whether it provides a secure framework for appropriate active travel, sustainable travel measures in the long term. It will then be within their gift to condition compliance with that and the submission of additional details as required. We're confident in that document and its content. We are satisfied that it's policy compliant, and that goes for the accessibility to bus services by foot, and in terms of the transport statements, accounts of access to kind of local facilities and such. So we're confident in that document, but obviously it is very much a consultative process, and we'll see what the Highway Authority come back with. If we have to make amendments, then we can look at that at the time.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Rich. I've got one comment to make, Chris. The play area, the leap, the hedgerow seems to sort of boundary it from the David Wilson site. I mean, I would have thought it'd be nice to have some way of a connection from the David Wilson sites up to the Wayne Home sites for that particular playground. If there's children who want to go to both, they can just go through the hedgerow, because I sort of get that they will eventually anyway, because that's what kids do. Whether there is a designated sort of gap in the hedge or not, the chances are they'll just make one. So you might as well do it now, and then it will be quite nice rather than just a bit of squashed hedgerow sort of thing. Yeah. I did when I was young, sorry. So that was my first comment. The pavement's up on the mount, and it was raised, spoke about for hours, and Councillor Kay raised it, and I totally agree with that there must be some sort of way of walking through that real nasty pinch point. I have no idea how that can be achieved, but I really do think that between highways and the developers, that they should try and find a solution for that, because it is a nasty little pinch point. And lastly, I sort of echo what Lizzie said about the energy sort of, the fabric first sort of approach, which even more so now with what's going on globally is vital, that the energy efficiency of buildings is goes way beyond not just 2013, 2021, but also 2025 standards, because energy prices aren't going to go down in the near future. So if we stop using it, then it makes life a lot easier. So that would be my other comment. Any other comments from anyone? Yes.
We have some comments, questions, observations from Michael Dunk. Have been posted. I think the first one about the building regs and the efficiency increase has been responded to already. So I was asking, you mentioned PV on housing, but can you quantify what size of PV array will be used on houses? Are they all 3.5 kilowatts, for example, and do all houses benefit from them? First one.
I can answer the first part of that very easily by saying I don't know. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have that information to hand.
Fair enough.
In respect to the provision, yeah, we are certainly looking at provision across the site in this instance, as I think was secured on the adjacent parcel.
Okay. So would you respond to Michael or me, and I can respond to Michael, or however you wish to do that?
No problem at all. No, I'm sure our energy consultants will tell me off for not reading their report properly. But
okay. So next question: will the houses be able to easily take an upgrade to an air source heat pump? He's put hat pump, I think he means heat pump, without extra insulation and ventilation, assuming that you will be fitting gas boilers. This may mean fitting a hot water tank, or at least allowing the space for one.
yeah, it's a very good question. In terms of boilers, obviously we would be looking at combi gas boilers. However, the properties, as you can see from the layout, would allow for the external installation of air source heat pumps, and the standards that they are built to internally provide opportunities for associated storage.
I think lastly, it's just more of a comment really. If hot water tanks are fitted, the excess electric from solar PV can be used to heat the water and reduce the bills for the homeowner. This is a low cost gain. This is a low cost gain, yeah. Okay.
Great, thanks for that. Any other questions and comments from anybody? Can't see anything. No, great. Yes, of course, you can.
Just, and again, it's me, because I'm here and I've got a microphone, so I'll be quick. A couple of the comments around cars and safety and security. And again, this is me, it's philosophical points rather than necessarily specifics, but I'd like you to think about them. That there seems to be a preference for the safety and security of cars rather than the safety and security of people. And God forbid that we should all have to look out of our houses at other people's cars or their children, but we're all happy to look out of our houses at our own cars and maybe our own children, I don't know. And I think that's, going back to some of the stuff that Paul said earlier, and that Paul talks about a lot, about kind of how we design communities and neighbourhoods that actually foster a sense of belonging somewhere and a sense of living with people. That's a mindset thing that needs to shift, because if we're parking the kids at the edge of a development and parking the cars in the middle, then we've got it wrong. That's it.
Thanks for that, Lizzie. Where are we then, Jane?
Where are we? I believe where we are is that, firstly, commending the improvements, especially to the access in the cycleways. Our concerns are that it's still a car-centric development. We've also got some concerns around the design and the street scenes in the layout are not providing a sense of community, and also with the play area on the edge of the development not being overlooked. We've still got concerns about energy efficiency, and would like to see more of a fabric-first approach, not connecting to gas boilers. Appreciating, we've heard Chris's response on that, and concerns about the footway still and transport plan. Obviously, all of that I would put into a more comprehensive response and then check that through councillors before it's sent off. But I think that they're the headlines of where we are at this stage, I think.
Yeah. Anyone any other comments from the guys online? No, I think as Jane said, I mean, it's moved an awful long way from when we first, I can't remember when we first saw this. It seems an awful long time ago. Yeah, I don't remember who I was. It was pre-COVID, I think. Anyway, so I think it's come a long, long way from where we saw it previously, and that's really, really commendable, and that's really good to see. I think there's just a couple of more steps to get us really on side. That's the sort of feel I'm getting from everyone. I don't know. Go on, Paul. You've always got to go on, Paul.
I can't actually remember what it was like when it
I had hair then.
I suspect it hasn't come that far.
No.
There's still the philosophy is, it hasn't changed, and and this is not just a criticism of this development. It's generally on all the most of the developments that we see. But yeah, there is still a way to go.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. So Jane, can you put that into some sort of a note for us all then?
If you're happy to vote on me doing that, so
right.
essentially the headlines that I've just read out, and then just delegate to me to put together a more comprehensive and formal response, which I will send around for sign off. I will propose that.
Well done, Lizzie. Paul can second it, and the guys and I.
And that's the majority.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. Thanks for your patience. Thank you. And now you must have lost the will to live by now, sir. You probably counted the number of tiles on the wall. Yeah. You picked the wrong meeting. Sorry. There's no other way of saying it. Yeah. Well, thank you for your patience. Is it? Yeah. if you want to know what's going on, come to the planning meetings. I can assure you, it's that you find out more. Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah. Great. So you're here to talk about the Windsor. So, yeah, and perhaps if you could just tell us who you are, and again, just for the people online.
My name's Mr. Lowe. I'm Kate's partner, looking to move into 73 Windsor Crescent. We initially did a design of a gable end roof, which we proposed. One side of me said it was okay, the other side said it wasn't. You guys objected, I believe. Had a planning officer came out in the name of Jennifer Alvis, came out to look at the proposed. I have an email from her. I'm not sure if you've had the ability to read it, or if she sends it to you. I don't honestly know. I'm all new to this. So I spoke to her today. She said, well, look, take it with you, read it out. So she came round, had a look, saw what we were proposing. Thanks for letting me come out last week. I've case reviewed your application with a senior officer this morning, and we feel that the impact on the neighbour through loss of light and overbearing is unlikely to be considered significant, which is the threshold for refusal. However, it would still be advisable to revise the design to a hipped roof, so some sort of compromise has been demonstrated. If you could provide the revised drawings to reflect this, I will reconsult the neighbour and parish in hopes that they may be content with this compromise. I have done the hip roof. It was a compromise, and the neighbour still said it's not good enough. So it's kind of where we are now. The first floor extension was done probably 1998. We've gone out to the left 18 years ago. All we're trying to do is go on top to create another bathroom and another bedroom. A gable end roof, he has said, will detract, I believe. A hip roof wouldn't. Jennifer came out, she said she'd advise it. She's gone back to her senior guy. I spoke to her today and she said that we are going to recommend it for approval. So I'm kind of new to this. I sell cars. I really don't know what else I can do. The guy next to me has said he doesn't want it going up to his boundary. He's incorrect. The original planning permission 18 years ago said the outside wall had to be 12 inches inside his boundary. So I actually own 12 inches of his garden that he doesn't know about, because the people that lived there before, instead of carrying the fence all the way down, we decided to stop on the outside because we thought a fence and then a 12-inch gap to the outside of the extension would just create weeds. So we've actually put plants all down the side. So I'm 12 inches from his boundary. I'm not near his boundary. He said to me that part of his objection was that he might put an extension on in the future. The lady, Jennifer, said, look, that's not for us to discuss what may happen in the future or will happen now. So he's asked me, or in his objection, he's put that he would like it stepped back and then gone in. But to me, putting a little box on top of a big box would look dreadful. I've been down the road. There's 3 or 4 full-width 2-storey extensions, albeit they don't come out quite as far as ours. And it's in the road. My architect has written down some things. I'm not sure if these are relevant, so I'll just, I'm sorry if they're trivial, but he's asked me. He said there is a way of coming out, even if we use something called permitted development rights. So I don't know what they are. But this outcome may be less favourable to the affected parties. I'm assuming that's the guy next door. A rough time sun path exercise has been carried out, and the new extension will have very little impact on the neighbouring property. There's several hip roof re-extensions in the town that set a precedent for this design. Any attempt to reduce mass with a reduced pitch or flat roof will not be in keeping with the local, what's on there at the moment, although this may have to be considered if necessary. The proposal currently illustrates a roof which is subservient to the main house roof. The ground floor is not directly on the party boundary. and he thinks some sort of alternative landscape may have a negative impact on light in the area. He understands the planning officer was happy with the latest design. MDC have not adopted a specific design code for extended houses in this area, but 10 basic design principles and sensible guidance. And as far as he can see from the guidance, the policy referenced by MDC, our proposal ticks all the boxes. So that's what he's asked me to read. I have no idea if that's relevant to anything at all. Like I said, I sell cars.
It's useful information, yeah.
Oh, is it? So, it's a very difficult situation. We're trying to extend the house because the moving costs to move somewhere else are astronomical, and for what it will cost us to put the extension on, we love the house in Windsor Crescent. It's an old school house, it's a Victorian house. We can't find anything in Froome with the garden, and it's an old school house. It has one bathroom. Well, my girlfriend's got 2 teenage daughters, and they spend more time in the bathroom than they do on their iPad. So if I'm going in, I need a bathroom. So that was the philosophy. A hipped roof, the idea was maybe to put some solar panels out the back. We want to use all light stuff out the back. I quite fancied the idea of some, they do like this Swedish wood that's really nice. But, you know, again, I'm governed by what you guys say. But my next door neighbour is, I've got to be politically correct, it's quite stubborn and quite set in his ways. And he just seems to object to everything, you know. He doesn't even realise the fence between our 2 properties is his, you know, and it's falling down. And, you know, every time you have a conversation, it's just, you know, it's just permanent. So it's trying to come to a compromise. I thought the hip roof would be a compromise for him because the planning officer came out, she stood in the garden and she said, look, it's not going to affect him the way he thinks it's going to affect him. And then I said, well, look, you can see 3 or 4 further down the road. And I went round and I looked at some and I knocked on some doors and, you know, saw some out, and they are the full width extensions. And I think if you don't put the full width in and the full length, it's just going to look like a box on top of a box. It'll look dreadful. That's where we are.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, as I say, thanks for coming and thanks for explaining. Paul, Lizzie?
Thank you. I was going to say you've done exactly the right thing. You've listened to the feedback that you got when you put the application in. You've talked to the planning officer, explained the situation. She's given some advice. You followed that advice. You've gone back to your architect and said, let's follow this advice. So you've done it right. Just to reassure you that even if it's your first time, you're pretty good at it. And you've brought us a lot more information and evidence than we hear from a lot of people. So you're doing a good job. Personally, I think that because you've made those changes, you know, when we first looked at it, it was like, wow, that does seem big. And the argument from the neighbour seemed kind of like, okay, this is something where I didn't feel that we could say yes to it because of that kind of conflict. But I think because you've made those changes, I don't personally have an objection to it. And I think it could be fine. Paul might disagree.
Thanks, Lizzie. Paul?
No, I don't disagree. I think Lizzie's right. But the important thing is to have a dialogue with the neighbour. And I don't know whether you've had a dialogue directly, or whether it's been through the planning system.
I was told just to go through the planners, sit back and let them deal with it. Not be rude. I'm never rude to anybody, you know. And it's not. We haven't fell out. We're not swearing. And it's just. I said to my architect, what do I do? And he said, just leave it to the experts. Just see how it pans out, because they deal with it all day, every day, but I don't. So that's kind of where we are.
And it's often good to have a dialogue, if you can, with a neighbour to come to some sort of compromise. I mean, it sounds like you have made a compromise, which is commendable, as Lizzie said. It would also be possible to compromise further if you were willing to, but from the sound of it, if the planning officer is prepared to approve it as it is, then there's possibly no reason for you to compromise further if you don't, you know, apart from keeping your neighbour happy. So that's, you know, I don't think, from our point of view, I think, you know, not having visited the site and looked at it, we probably have to go with what the planning officer's feedback is. So I don't think we can really object to it if the planning officer's happy.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if, I can't see anyone online. Is anyone online?
Do you mean attendees as
Yes.
opposed to?
Yeah, sorry. Great. Rich, sorry. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking about your comment about solar panels. You can get triangular shaped solar panels. They don't have to be rectangles. So just a thought there. And I actually, now I've looked at the drawings again and listened to what you had to say, I think this is much, much better than it was. And like Paul said, if the planning officer says it's okay, well, I don't have an objection particularly, but I suppose the key is to stay on good terms with your neighbour. But as far as this goes, I don't think I have any objections anymore. That's me.
Thanks, Rich. And Sheila. Thanks, Sheila.
Just to basically reiterate actually what others are saying, that about the communication with your neighbour. It's always good to talk and keep up that communication. And if there are other neighbours who are along, who feel that what you're doing is fine and can explain it to your neighbour as well, that might be another way of doing it. So he's not just bashing up against you all the time, that you might like to, because his comments are worth hearing. And I think there are, just to keep the portals open is really important so that you can actually understand what he's up to and he knows why you're doing what you're doing. He might just stick his heels in, and that you can't do much about that, but it is good to talk.
Thanks, Sheila. From my perspective, yeah, I sort of agree with what everyone said, really. I think changes you've made make a big difference, and thanks very much for coming and explaining.
For listening.
Just saw it took 2.5 hours to get there.
Well worth 2.5 hours.
But yeah, I don't have any objection to the advised plans, and I think, like everyone said, it'd be good to keep the dialogue open with the neighbour.
Absolutely.
And Jane's going to say something.
Jane is going to say something, just a procedural thing, really, from our point of view, because this application wasn't on the list when the agenda went out.
Oh, right.
Because actually I thought I'd missed it off of the list, but the notification from NDIP actually came through after the list was put together, so that explains that. So what I'm trying to say is this won't be a case of voting, because it isn't on the list, so we can't vote on it, but we do have the delegated powers between you and me to deal with urgent items outside of it. I'm conscious of the fact that the neighbour wouldn't have been aware that it was on the agenda necessarily, but just to say, we have read the comments that have been submitted by the neighbours, so we're aware of those. So if both you and I are happy, we can
I'm happy.
we can send back a comment of no objection. I think we might just put a little note on there to say that we would encourage you to have a conversation with your neighbour.
Well, that's fine. I'm good at talking.
Obviously, this meeting is being streamed live, and a recording of the meeting will be able to be viewed afterwards. Yeah.
Does that mean that there's no objection and it should be okay?
Yeah.
You've made my girlfriend very happy. Thank you very much for your time.
And you'll get a bathroom.
Sure.
I'll get a bathroom.
Yeah.
I'll do it first.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks again. Thanks for waiting.
Absolutely no problem at all.
Thank you. Have a good night.
So I haven't raised any other applications specifically for discussion, unless any councillors would like to raise any others.
That's a rhetorical question, by the way.
Just smiling.
Don't even think about it, okay? Right, so can we vote that we have no objection to the other applicants? Is that what we have to say?
There are a couple of comments I've made on some of the applications that we would defer to the Conservation Officer's comments, but other than that, yes, they're all no objection.
Great. If Paul or Lizzie could propose that, please. Lizzie can second it, I hope.
And that's the majority.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're working so hard, you lot.
That's
Well done, well done.
the date of the next meeting is the 28th of April. And thank you all for turning up and